All right, guys, welcome to Saluda Baptist Church Youth Podcast. I'm your host, Pastor Brandon, and thank you for joining us as we recap this week in our youth ministry here at Saluda Baptist Church, and as we go through our weekly Bible study that we have each Wednesday night. So we just started a study through the book of Romans, and last week we were in chapter 1, and we looked at verses 1 through 17. And this week, we're going to be looking at verses 18 through 32. And last week, we talked about the gospel and how Paul wrote this letter to a church in Rome that was struggling. He had never been there, but he had heard a lot about them. And he wasn't a part of the original plant of this church, but he knew that in the church at Rome, they had many disagreements. They were not united on the gospel. They were not sharing the gospel with others. This church, they went through very, very heavy persecution. All the Christians there were actually ran out of Rome. And when they gathered back together, there were the Jewish Christians that worshiped in this way. There were the Gentile Christians, so those non-Jewish Christians that they worshiped in a very different way, and they just were not united. They had a lot of disagreements. And so Paul wrote this letter to encourage them, to share the truth of the gospel with them, to try to unify and unite them on the core truth of the gospel, and to also motivate them to come together as a community, as a family, to be united, and to also motivate them to go out and share the gospel. And in Romans 1, verses 16 through 17, we learned about the passion that Paul had for the gospel. At the very beginning of chapter 1, we saw that Paul described himself as a servant of Jesus and one that was called out for the purpose of sharing the gospel. And in verses 16 and 17, Paul said he was not ashamed of the gospel. He was not ashamed, and he gave two reasons. He said that the gospel was the power of God for salvation, and that the gospel revealed the righteousness of God. Now, we know that the gospel is the power of God for salvation because it is only through the gospel, through the truth of who Jesus is and what he did on the cross, and through his resurrection, that is the only thing that can save us. So the gospel is the power of God for our salvation and the only way that we can be saved. But the gospel also reveals the righteousness of God through Jesus. Jesus came and perfectly lived the life that we could not live, perfectly fulfilled all of the law, perfectly demonstrated what righteousness was, and reveals through his life our unrighteousness. And we know that righteousness is being right with God. It is doing what is right in God's sight. It is standing right with God. And so Paul ends that first section in verse 17 by describing how God reveals the righteousness of God through the gospel. And then when we come to where we're going to be talking about this week in verse 18, we're going to see how Paul begins to describe our need of the gospel, for all of humanity's need of the gospel, by pointing out our own failures and our own unrighteousness. And so he begins in verse 18 by saying, "For God's wrath is revealed from heaven against all godless and unrighteousness of people who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth." So he begins in verse 18. It says, God's wrath again is revealed from heaven against all the godless and unrighteousness. He starts with the wrath of God. Now, wrath is an intense, extreme anger that results in the need to punish someone for an action that has caused that extreme anger. And so this word, this wrath of God, that is a very intense thing that we're talking about. And we know and we're taught, right? We don't need to be angry. When we're angry, that's bad. And so we think about this idea of God and wrath and basically God being angry. And, we ask ourselves, can God get angry and still be righteous and just? And the answer to that is absolutely Yes. If we can imagine, a time where, let's just say we go out, we leave a grocery store or leave a building and we see someone in a parking lot and they're being assaulted. They're being beaten up. Let's just say it's an old lady and you see, a man beating up an old lady. And you see that, the first thought that's going to go through your mind is you're going to be angry when you see that man doing that to that older woman, beating up that older woman. You're going to have an anger within you to do something about it. And that anger that we have is not a wrong or unjust anger or an unrighteous anger. That anger we have is because we know that action is not good. And if we love good, we have to hate evil. And if we don't hate evil, that means if we look at someone and they're going through an evil time, if we don't hate that, we're not going to be able to show the proper compassion and love to them in that situation. So if we truly love good, we have to hate evil. And so God is good, and God has this extreme anger against all the godless and all the unrighteous. Because he is good, he hates evil. And it says here that his wrath is for those that are godless, for those that are unrighteous. We see here godless. We think of someone that denies God, that does not believe in God. Maybe they call themselves an atheist. Maybe they call themselves an agnostic. Maybe they have a different faith where they believe in something else other than the one true God that is the creator of heaven and earth. That's what makes them godless. And then it says the unrighteous. So those that are wicked, those that practice evil, is against those that God pours out his wrath. It says here, his wrath is revealed from heaven against the godless, those who reject him, those who don't believe, and the unrighteous, those who practice wickedness, those who live evil. And it says that his wrath is against these people who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. They hold back the truth. They don't let the truth of who God is rise in their lives. Instead, they hold it back. They push it back by their wickedness, by their lifestyle of unrighteousness. They hold back and push down the truth. And so right away, just from this first verse, we see that Paul is basically saying, hey, God is going to reveal his wrath from heaven like a judgment against these people. So it's almost like Paul is presenting a case against them for doing wrong. So we have the godless and we have the unrighteous. And we see that Paul begins to strengthen his case. Like, all right, the wrath of God is against you. Well, why? And then in verse 19, it says, since what can be known about God is evident among them because God has shown it to them. So the unrighteous and the godless, those that live in wicked lifestyles and those that live not believing, not following God, they face God's wrath because God has shown them the truth of who he is, that it is evident that it can be known that he is real and what he has created them for, because it's there and he has shown it to them. And verse 20 shows us how he's shown that. It says, for his invisible attributes, that is his eternal power, okay, how powerful God is, his divine nature, that he is divine, he is the one true God, have been clearly seen since the creation of the world, being understood through what he has made. As a result, people are without excuse. So through the creation, through what God has made, God reveals who he is, that he exists to the world. And that through his creation, No one is without excuse. No one has an excuse. Hey, I didn't know. Hey, I didn't know that God existed. I had no idea, because God has revealed that to him. I mean, just think about how complex the human body is. Think about all the things that are connected together. We have a nervous system, we have blood vessels, we have muscles, we have bones, we have tendons, we have, DNA, like the smallest of things. And even our DNA is so complex. And we have people that don't believe in God, but they can look at all that evidence of how complex our bodies are, and they come to their own conclusion. And you wonder, how can that be so? Like, how can someone be so godless? And we see that that's possible because they reject who God is. And so we move on to verse 21. It says, "For though they knew God, they did not glorify him as God or show gratitude. Instead, their thinking became worthless, and their senseless hearts were darkened." So it says they knew God. They had all the evidence. God revealed who he was to them, but they chose not to glorify him, not to show gratitude to him, but instead they focused on their own thinking. And it says here in verse 21, their thinking became worthless. And then it says their senseless hearts were darkened. You think about all these people that are godless, that don't believe in God, atheist, agnostic, whatever the case may be, highly, highly intelligent people a lot of the time. And, they have many, many eloquent, arguments, and they have all of these, these scientific things sometimes. Other times it's other things, and they have very, very intelligent sounding things that they use their brain, their thinking, to convince themselves that God does not exist. But here it says, instead, their thinking became worthless. All of their thinking, all those things that they come up with in their mind, it's worthless. And why? Why do they do that? Well, it says in the same verse that their hearts were darkened. Their hearts became darkened to the truth, to the light of who God was. Their hearts were darkened. Verse 22 says, claiming to be wise, they became fools. Again, they have all that knowledge, yet it ends in foolishness because they deny the obvious. They deny the truth that is just revealed simply through what has been created. As we see in verse 20, their wisdom is their own foolishness. In verse 23, it says, and they exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man, birds, four-footed animals, and reptiles. See, because of this rejection of God, it says their minds began to make the wrong conclusions. It became foolishness. And then they exchanged the truth, the glory of who God is, and instead they exchanged that for images of mortal man, right? Birds, animals, reptiles. It's very reminiscent of the people of Israel. They had witnessed God do amazing things. They had witnessed God deliver them out of Egypt, save them from the armies chasing after them, parting the Red Sea, destroying the armies of Egypt, providing for them a cloud by day, fire by night to guide them, giving them manna and quail in the desert to eat, to provide all of these things for them. And what do? They worshiped a golden calf that they made. And we look at that and we think, how ridiculous. If we see all these things that God has done, they saw all of these amazing, wonderful things, and they rejected him for this golden calf. And we think that's so crazy. And we look at people the same way. We look at the atheists. We look at the agnostic. We look at those that worship other false gods, and we're like, you see all of these things that the one true God does. You see how he created everything, and you don't believe in God. How foolish. How can you reject God? But we do the same thing. Every time we sin, every time we choose to follow our own hearts, to follow our own desires, our own passion, we're rejecting God in the same way. Just as it says here that they exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man, birds, four-footed animals, reptiles. Every time we sin, we're exchanging the glory of God for something that he has created. We're rejecting God, just as they rejected God. And then moving on into verse 24, we see how when you reject God and you reject the things of God, you begin to fall into a pattern of wickedness. Verse 24 says, "Therefore God delivered them over in the desires of their hearts to sexual impurity, so their bodies were degraded among themselves." So we reject God, and then we begin to fall into wickedness because God gives us over to the desires of our heart. And the Bible says in Jeremiah 17, verse 9, that our hearts are wicked and they're incurable. So who can believe it? Our hearts are wicked. When we follow the desires of our heart, it's going to lead us into a path of wickedness, of sin, of unrighteousness. So when we reject God and reject following his truth and the way he wants us to live, and instead follow our own hearts, our own passions, our own desires, we're following our hearts that are wicked and evil. And we're going to fall into that path. And that's what it says here in verse 24, that they fell into these desires, and the example it uses is sexual impurity. But verse 25 says, they exchanged the truth of God for a lie and worshiped and served what has been created instead of the Creator, who is praised forever. Amen. So when we reject God, we fall into this path of unrighteousness, of wickedness, where we exchange who God is and his truth for lies. And we begin to worship and serve what God has created instead of him. And you got to think, that's exactly what happened in the garden with Adam and Eve, right? When the serpent came and tempted them, they exchanged the truth of who God is and what he said. They rejected him. And then they fell into this path, this life of unrighteousness, of wickedness, by instead choosing to worship themselves in this tree, in this fruit. Then we move into verse 26. And so we see that we have this rejection of God that leads into a falling into a life of unrighteousness, of wickedness. And so what Paul begins to do here in the last half of this, or the last section of this chapter, in verses 26 through 32, is he begins to show how this sin, this wickedness, is expressed in our lives. So the order of events as we get to verse 26 is we see there are the godless and there are the unrighteousness. The godless and the unrighteous that deserve the wrath of God, they reject God, then they fall into wickedness, and then their lives are fully given over to sin. And that's what we begin to see described here in verse 26. It says, "For this reason God delivered them over to disgraceful passions." So we'll stop right here. We see that God gave them over to their passions. This goes back to the desires of their heart. God isn't pushing this on them, right? God is basically, it's free will. It's God allowing them to do what they are desiring to do. So we see that when we reject God and we fall into a life where we are pursuing godlessness, and then we fall into unrighteousness, the first thing that we do, what the natural progression, is that we begin to live the opposite of how God designed us and created us to live. And we see that expressed in verse 26. It says, God delivered them over to disgraceful passions. Their women exchanged natural sexual relations for unnatural ones. Verse 27, the men in the same way also left natural relations with women and were inflamed in their lust for one another. Men committed shameless acts with men and received in their own persons the appropriate penalty of their error. So Paul gives us an illustration here in the design that God had for sex, how God had designed sex to be between one man and one woman in the covenant of marriage for a purpose, right? God created it good and for a purpose. But in the rejection of God and the falling into wickedness and unrighteousness, we see that sin distorts what God had created good. And we see that given over to their own passions, they fall into this lifestyle of homosexuality. And yes, in these verses, in verses 26 and 27, there's no way that you can work around that Paul here is describing homosexuality as being opposite of the way that God had designed it to be. Paul calls it a disgraceful passion, that they're going opposite of what God has created them for. There's no way to avoid it. There's no way to deny it. We come across it in the text, so we have to address it. That Paul is condemning this lifestyle, that this lifestyle is contrary to how God created it to be. Now, I'm not going to get into the politics of marriage, gay marriage. I'm not going to get into, hey, someone says that they were born this way or that they made the choice. Like, none of that matters, right? What does matter is that God is saying his design, how he created us, is opposite of this lifestyle. But not only this lifestyle, we can get hung up on talking about just homosexuality, but Paul goes on to say, verses 29 through 32, a whole list of ways that we are living contrary to how God has created us to be. This is just the one illustration that he chooses in verses 26 and 27. And in verses 28, it's kind of like Paul, he goes a little bit more specific and then he backs up a little bit and says, and because they did not think it worthwhile to acknowledge God, God delivered them over to a corrupt mind so that they do what is not right. So up until this point, as we've gone through these verses, we see God talk about the desires, or Paul talk about the desires of their heart, having this disgraceful passions, following after the lusts of their heart. And now here we see Paul describe that they're given over to a corrupt mind. So the godless and the unrighteous, not only do they follow after the lust and the sin in their heart, but it also corrupts their mind. Remember we talked earlier about their corrupted, or their way of thinking being worthless, and that their wisdom is really foolishness. So it kind of goes full circle that when we choose to live a godless lifestyle and we live in wickedness and unrighteousness, our heart is being deceived. Our heart is full of sin, but our mind is also corrupted. And so we begin to seek these things that are contrary to what God says, and we reject his standards. We reject what he says, and so it corrupts our minds, and we begin to seek the things that are contrary to who he is. And so this rejection of God, it leads us to many, many sins. And it goes on in verse 29, it says, they are filled with an unrighteousness, evil, greed, wickedness. They are full of envy, murder, quarrels, deceit, and malice. They are gossips. Verse 30, slanderers, God-haters, arrogant, proud, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents. Verse 31, senseless, untrustworthy, unloving, and unmerciful. And in verse 32, although they know God's just sentence, that those who practice such things deserve to die, they not only do them, but even applaud others who practice them. This is the descent into sin, into wickedness, into unrighteousness. That all of these things, not just the one thing that we want to highlight, like we love picking on homosexuality or all these other hot button topics, right? But Paul says gossip, deceit, envy, murder, being disobedient to parents, all of these things that describe us. That is the result of our sin. And that is us falling into wickedness. And Paul says that it's so bad that even though we know the truth, we reject all of that for those things. And he ends by saying they not only do them, but they applaud others who practice them. That is how far we have fallen into this unrighteousness. As Paul is describing our need for this gospel, for the gospel that shows the righteousness of God, he's showing us just how unrighteous we are, and so how desperately we need the gospel. Now, Paul doesn't stop at just talking about the godless, those who don't believe in God, or the unrighteous, those who live evil, wicked lives. But we're going to talk about next week, as we go into chapter 2, Paul's even going to address those that consider themselves religious. Because the gospel isn't just for those who we think are, godless, who don't believe in God, or for the people we think are wicked, but it's for us. It's for all of us. We all need the gospel. So that's our study through Romans 1:18 through 32. So I hope this blesses you. I hope you can see from Paul's presentation of this how much sin has separated us from the truth of who God is, and how much we desperately need him. And that's the hope that we have. That's what makes the gospel so good, is how much we desperately need it, how lost we are without it. So I hope this blesses you, and hopefully we will see you guys next week. God bless.